Now, if you look at the amount of time the heart spends in each phase, it's a 2/3, 1/3 ratio. 2/3 of the time the heart is in diastole. Only 1/3 of the time is it spent in systole. Arterial anastomoses provide collateral flow to the same area. This is protective. This is an anastomosis. This is an anastomosis. If there's a clog somewhere in this branch of vessels, so this network of vessels, there's other vessels that can bypass it that can still get blood to the same area. Or blood coming down the anterior interventricular artery, blood coming down the posterior interventricular artery. Because they are joined by an anastomosis, one entire artery could be clogged, and the other one can still bring blood flow to the tissue. Anyone know the example of this in the brain? It's called circle of Willis. It's a giant anastomosis. So blood coming through the vertebral arteries and blood coming up through the internal carotids both feed into that anastomosis. So if one of those arteries is occluded, the other one can still feed the same tissue. You tend to see lots of anastomoses in the heart and in the brain for that very reason, because it's protective. So that when there are small blockages, hopefully there's an alternate path that can still get blood to the same tissue. When we look at models and pictures of blood vessels in general, including the coronary arteries, keep in mind there is some amount of individual variation. So you may not have the exact same setup as the model or image that you're looking at. We're all a little bit different, and you'll see an example of that when I show you the dissection videos. How the person's blood vessels looks a little different from the pictures and models that we're used to. All right, so the basic vessels of the coronary circulation, this does not account for all of them, but just the major ones. Left and right coronary arteries that come off of the aorta. That left coronary artery is very short because it immediately splits, and typically when a vessel branches or splits, the vessels that come off of it have new names. A second reason why a vessel's name might change even if there is no branch, it's just going through a new region. So you have an artery that goes under the clavicle, subclavian artery, but then that same artery without branching goes through the armpit, axillary artery, and then through the arm, brachial artery. And then it does finally split into an ulnar and a radial. But prior to that, no splitting, just it's in a different region, it gets a different name. So those are the two reasons for giving a vessel a different name, a new name. It's a branch, or it's the same vessel in a different region. So this one branches, this becomes circumflex, this becomes anterior interventricular. Circumflex, as the name implies, wraps around. And what groove is it following right here? Coronary sulcus or AV sulcus, atrioventricular. And then it feeds into this anastomosis, and then the blood supply coming from the other side that goes into that same anastomosis. It's coming off the right coronary artery, but even though we have these branches coming off, we don't change the name. It's still right coronary all the way around, all the way to the very back. So left coronary to circumflex brings you to here. Right coronary brings you to here, to this anastomosis that joins them. There are two branches that you need to know that come off the right coronary. One is marginal. So it's right on the margin of the heart where it kind of has an edge to it. And then the other is this one here, posterior interventricular. This is considered a branch off of right coronary. So left has two branches, and right has two branches, the marginal, the posterior interventricular. All they're showing you here is arteries and just the major ones. This is probably 1% of the arterial blood supply of the heart. So we are barely scratching the surface. Same thing here. There's way more veins than this, but we're just looking at and naming the large ones. And we're taking the arteries out just to make it more simple. So we just focus on the veins. Coronary sinus. It receives blood from 4 vessels, one of which is not shown here. So you have the great cardiac. It starts in this groove in the front, which is anterior interventricular groove. And then it gets into this groove up here, which is coronary sulcus, or AV. So the great cardiac empties into the coronary sinus. Middle cardiac runs through what groove? On the backside. Posterior interventricular empties into coronary sinus. Anterior cardiac veins go directly into the right atrium, but you typically don't see the little holes in the right atrium from a picture or model. Typically the only holes that you see is coronary sinus, superior vena cava, inferior vena cava. So these go directly into right atrium. But the rest of it is called a small cardiac vein. So it comes up the margin, wraps around the coronary sulcus, and into the coronary sinus. So the one that's missing here is right about here. It's the posterior cardiac vein. So you have the great, the middle, the small, and the posterior, 4 veins that empty into the coronary sinus. And then the anterior cardiac veins, they go directly into the right atrium. On all the other images, you see both, the arteries and the veins at the same time. Here's the posterior that we didn't see in the previous image. Here it is again. So it's right between great and middle. So actually, the way it was turned, it would actually be over here, not over here. It's over here, between great and middle. Here's your anterior cardiac veins going into the right atrium. Right coronary artery with that marginal branch there. Left coronary with the circumflex and anterior interventricular branches. Coronary sinus, receiving blood from middle cardiac vein, posterior cardiac vein, great cardiac vein, and then on the other side would be small cardiac vein. Small, middle, posterior, great. 4, emptying into coronary sinus. Where does yours end? Is that about where it ends? Or we barely get into? Okay. Homeostatic imbalance, coronary artery disease, CAD. We'll talk more about this in the next chapter on blood vessels. But coronary artery disease typically involves partial or even a complete block in a major artery, typically due to atherosclerosis or a thrombus, and the two are connected. Right? Blood clots often form along, I don't want to say undamaged, along vessel walls that are not ruptured but are roughened and inflamed from atherosclerosis. So if a blood clot is forming along a vessel wall where there's a lot of plaque, atherosclerosis, would that be a normal blood clot or an inappropriate blood clot?
Inappropriate.
It's always inappropriate unless there's an actual hole in the vessel wall that's causing blood to bleed out. So there's no bleeding, it's just a roughened, damaged vessel wall. Unfortunately, clots can form that way. So it could be a combination of both. People that have atherosclerosis are at much higher risk for emboli. So this is a cause and effect situation. If you have occlusion, partial or complete, you have insufficient blood flow to some part of the myocardium. The term that means is insufficient blood flow is ischemia. So coronary ischemia, because it's affecting the heart. The cells, after a while, after they receive inadequate blood flow for seconds or minutes, start releasing chemicals like ADP that causes pain. And the term that means pain is angina. Pectoris, chest. So pain in the chest pain is angina pectoris. And quite often, when someone is experiencing angina pectoris, what's the cause of the pain? Well, we went through the cause. What's the pain associated with? What really bad thing is probably happening at the same time you're experiencing that pain? Heart attack, myocardial infarction. An infarct is an area of damaged or dead cells, necrotic tissue. So that's the cause and effect path. It starts with inadequate blood flow from atherosclerosis, which can clog up a vessel, or maybe a thrombus has formed, clogging the vessel. Maybe it broke off, ended up becoming an emboli, clogging a smaller vessel downstream. All are potential reasons for the coronary ischemia, the insufficient blood flow to the tissue, causing the cells to release chemicals that triggers pain, angina pectoris. And if this continues, if the cells continue to receive inadequate blood flow, they eventually die. And when the cells of the myocardium die, that's an infarct. The dead cells represent necrotic tissue or necrosis. Angina pectoris may also be caused by stress-induced spasms. So it's often associated with a heart attack, but not necessarily. Spasm refers to constriction of the coronary vessels, just like vascular spasm as the first phase of hemostasis. So vascular spasm, vasoconstriction means the same thing. Stress can trigger this, can cause those coronary arteries to constrict, and that could be the cause of the reduced blood flow, and thus the ischemia, and thus the angina pectoris. What could somebody take that would very, very quickly get into the bloodstream and reach these vessels and dilate them? They can take it sublingually. Yeah, nitroglycerin, yep. So people that have a history of cardiovascular disease, coronary artery disease in particular, probably carry around nitroglycerin. Pop it under the tongue, dissolves, get into the bloodstream very quickly, and dilates those vessels, and basically stops the spasm. Damage to which chamber is the most serious, and why? Left ventricle, because it pumps blood into the systemic circuit, right? Everywhere. The blood flowing through the pulmonary circuit really has one purpose, and it's not to nourish any tissue. It's to surround those little air sacs in the lungs, to pick up oxygen and get rid of CO2. That's the sole purpose of blood flowing through the pulmonary circuit, not for nourishment. In fact, the lungs themselves, the airways, those tissues are nourished from the systemic circuit. So you have systemic arteries and veins in the lungs as well. But they just don't go around those little air sacs. That's pulmonary. Treatments: catheter and atherectomy. And I haven't checked these links this semester. Hopefully they're all still good. They have been for years now. So here we have normal blood flow through one of our coronary arteries. Here we have occlusion, maybe from a clot, maybe from atherosclerosis. So we need to do something to remove the blockage and or open up the vessel. So one treatment, catheter and atherectomy. So they're going to go in with a catheter. They have a little instrument that can scrape the plaque off the wall of the vessel, and you don't want it to float downstream and clog some other vessel. So there's like a little vacuum that sucks it up. So you scrape it off, suck it up, see if that relieves the occlusion. Coronary angioplasty and stent. So you go in, and instead of scraping off the wall, the plaque, you go in with a deflated balloon. Once you get the balloon into position, you inflate it, and it props open the vessel. And then you leave behind a little sleeve, a little wire mesh sleeve. and then you deflate the balloon, pull the guide wire back out, but you leave that little stent behind. So it's just a little wire sleeve that keeps the vessel propped open. The problem is, over years, the same plaque formation that caused the vessel to become occluded can gunk up the wire mesh, the stent, and it can become, it can cause occlusion as well. So sometimes the stents have to be replaced.
Can the same thing happen to the first?
So after you clean out all the gunk, it could reappear? Absolutely.
Since it's already roughened up, right?
True. Yeah. So you might have to do that on a somewhat regular basis. The stents have to be replaced on a somewhat regular basis.
They don't
in most
smooth
people.
it out or anything?
What's that?
They don't smooth it out?
As much as they can. And then they hope it just repairs itself. But the things that caused it to gunk up in the first place, genetics, diet, lack of exercise, if those things don't change, you can't change your genes, right? Most likely it's going to come back. So it buys you time.
You were talking earlier, like, if one of them were occluded, then you would have alternate pathway. But on the right, does that mean the second pathway is also occluded?
So that works when we kind of get down close to the capillaries and we have multiple arterioles or small arteries kind of coming to a similar region. This, unfortunately, is right at the beginning of the pathway. If you have a major occlusion in the right coronary artery or the left coronary artery, you're not going to be able to compensate for that with anastomoses. That's going to cause some probably large amount of tissue to starve for blood flow. But maybe a small branch off of one of those coronaries, then you might be okay with an alternate path.
So if it's like at the end of some branch, it doesn't really matter that much?
Yeah, exactly. Somewhere down in here, for example, maybe that wouldn't be as big of a deal, but not at the very beginning of the pathway. That's a big problem. Here it's in the right coronary artery. Here it looks like it's coming off the left coronary artery. So they do the angioplasty to image the occlusion. And once they discover where it is, then they can go in with a guide wire and place a stent and keep that vessel propped open. If the atherectomy and the stents, if those things aren't working, then bypass surgery. It's the most invasive, so it's kind of, last on the list, worst case scenario. Bypass means we go and take a vessel from somewhere else in your body. Usually it's a vein from the great saphenous, which is in your lower limb. Take a little piece of that vein, and then we cut out the bad part of the, say, coronary artery, and then patch it in with the vein. Suture it in. So bypass means you literally take that bad piece of vessel out. You bypass it by putting a good vessel from typically a vein in its place. Quadruple bypass just means you've done 4 of those. 4 different spots you had to cut out bad coronary arteries or branches of them and replace it with veins. And we can get by with putting veins in there in place of arteries because the pressures aren't too high. Next is anatomy review, brief atlas. If you don't have the brief atlas, it's okay because you have these on D2L. But anything that's underlined, be able to identify on the cartoon diagrams as well as the real images, the cadaver images. So here it would be like aorta, vena cava, auricle, interventricular sulcus, left ventricle, right ventricle, apex, and the cut pericardium, which we can see right there. Basically the same things here. Pulmonary trunk. Here we actually have the vessels. So anterior interventricular artery along with the great cardiac vein. Marginal artery over here, and the small cardiac vein is right in that same area. They've got an anterior cardiac vein up here going right into the right atrium. aorta right above the pulmonary trunk. Internal anatomy, so now you can see papillary muscles, trabeculae carnae, chordae tendineae, the cusps of the AV valves, the septum. Blood, this one's good for blood vessels. Shows the posterior cardiac. And then you have the grate in the middle. Here you can see all 4 valves. The AV valves are much larger than the semilunar valves. This shows that spiraling orientation of the muscle. Atria have been removed here. These are the AV valves. Here you can see the cusps of one of your semilunars. This would be aortic semilunar. Over here, intact, is the pulmonary semilunar. Heart removed, but the pericardium left behind. And you can also see some of those great vessels, inferior vena cava, right next to the aorta. And between them, esophagus. All 3 of those things, by the way, have to go through the diaphragm, so there's a hole for each one. All right, so that gets into valves. All right, and then the last review is Ackland's DVD Atlas of Human Anatomy, disc number 6. You can pick these up really cheap. There's used copies all over the place. If you were to buy just one, I would buy volume 6. It covers pretty much everything we're going to look at this semester. The other 5 DVDs are mainly covering nervous system, muscular system, bones. So they'll show you head and limbs as well as the trunk itself.
Begin by seeing where it is. We tend to put the heart here in our imagination, but in reality, it's much closer to the midline. Seen from in front, the heart is here. It lies behind the sternum and directly above the diaphragm. Seen from the side, the heart is here, occupying almost all the space between the vertebral bodies behind and the sternum in front. When the diaphragm moves, the heart moves with it. To get our first look at the heart, we'll start by removing the upper extremities and all the shoulder muscles that surround the upper thorax, so as to leave just the thorax itself, enclosed by the ribs and intercostal muscles. Then we'll remove this part of the rib cage on each side, revealing the lungs, which are fully inflated here.
Probably a smoker.
When we let the lungs deflate, we can see the heart behind the sternum, contained within its protective jacket of pericardium. To see it better, we'll take the lungs, the sternum, and the pericardium out of the picture. This is the heart. This is the diaphragm. The major.
What's this little cord-like connective tissue right here? Ligamentum arteriosus, which used to be the ductus arteriosus. The aorta is like a garden hose. It's the size and thickness of a garden hose. When we bring the cadavers in, put on a pair of gloves and feel it. It's pretty amazing how thick and durable it is.
Your blood vessels that lead into and out of the heart take up almost as much space as the heart itself. Now that we've seen where the heart is, we'll take a detailed look at it. We'll look at its 4 chambers and its 4 valves. Then we'll look at the great vessels that enter and leave the heart. And lastly, we'll look at the coronary arteries. Because we so often see simplified diagrams of the heart like this, we tend to think the atria, the inlet chambers, are above, and the ventricles, the pumping chambers, are below. It's perhaps surprising to see that in reality, the atria aren't above the ventricles, they're behind them. Here's the heart in isolation. Here are the ventricles in front. Here are the atria behind. This generous coating of epicardial fat makes it hard to see the four chambers distinctly. To see them more clearly, we'll go to a heart in which almost all the fat has been removed. In this specimen, all four chambers have been distended with equal pressure, making the atria somewhat larger than normal. This is a directly posterior view of the heart. This is a directly anterior view. The massive, thick-walled left ventricle projects forward and to the left. The thinner-walled right ventricle is partially wrapped around the left one. We'll see the ventricles by themselves in a minute. For now, let's go round to the back and look at the two atria. This is the left atrium. This is the right atrium. Blood coming from the upper part of the body enters the right atrium by way of the superior vena cava. Blood coming from the lower part of the body enters it by way of the much larger inferior vena cava. In a more intact dissection, here's the inferior vena cava coming up through the diaphragm and almost immediately entering the right atrium. In addition to the two venae cavae, blood from the heart itself enters the right atrium under here by way of the coronary sinus, which we'll see later. From the upper part of the right atrium, this blind pouch, the right auricle or atrial appendage, projects forwards. The thin wall of the right atrium is formed largely of muscle. When the atrium contracts in diastole, the blood in it passes forwards into the right ventricle through the right atrioventricular valve or tricuspid valve, which is here. The left atrium and the right atrium are in contact here, where they share a common wall, the interatrial septum, which lies quite obliquely. To look at the inside of the right atrium, we'll remove this part of its wall. Here's the opening of the superior vena cava above and of the inferior vena cava below. Here's the opening of the coronary sinus. This is the part of the atrial wall that's shared with the left atrium, the interatrial septum. This thin oval patch in the septum is the fossa ovale, the remnant of the foramen ovale that connected the two atria in intrauterine life. Here we're looking forwards into the tricuspid valve. We'll see more of it when we look at the right ventricle. Now we'll move on to look at the left atrium. Blood coming from the left